Hi, welcome to the Forward Food Tech podcast, where we explore the future of food and agriculture with the people who are taking us there. In this episode, our guest is David Farquhar, CEO of IGS. IGS is an agritech business that started in 2013, revolutionizing the indoor growing market. David joined the team in November 2017 and successfully raised a £7 million Series A and total investment to date of £13.8 million. Now, IGS are looking towards global expansion. David will tell us more about the patented technology IGS have created, their TCEA, Total Controlled Environment Agriculture platform, and the intelligent grid technology to control environmental elements including lighting, watering, CO2 levels, and nutrient delivery, whilst benefiting from significant gains in controls and cost reductions. Tune in to hear about these cutting-edge technology platforms, creating ideal climates for plants and people. Here's the conversation between Rob and David.
David, I'd like to welcome you to the Forward Food Tech podcast. Really excited to have you on board because this is the first podcast where we are identifying and dealing with the topic of vertical farming and its potential for the future. Just quickly introduce IGS and how long you've been doing this and where you're going with it now.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Very happy to be here. So IGS is an 8-year-old company founded by a real farmer up in Aberdeenshire who was growing microgreens and high-end veg, sort of baby veg, in polytunnels, and wanted to do that 12 months of the year. Perfectly feasible up there because of the very long summer days, and actually there's a lot of sunshine. Great in the summer, but in the winter absolutely impossible. So the need was to find a way of delivering supplementary lighting. Most crops will take up to 18 hours a day if you think about the length of a summer day in a temperate climate, during the growing season. And so in theory, you can deliver 18-hour days, 12 months of the year, 365 days of the year. So what Henry wanted to do was to see if he could provide that supplementary lighting, perhaps along with some monitoring and some climate control. And it just so happened that an American professor who was at the time at St Andrews University had invented the LED light back in the day, and Henry teamed up with him, John Allen, and together they proved on something the size of your desk that yes, indeed, you could grow crops or cause them to grow using manipulated LED light. And the whole story kind of went from there. The business spent 5 years in stealth mode. I joined late 17, early 18, since when we have raised our Series A finance from 3 of the biggest agri-tech investors in the world, plus the Scottish Investment Bank. We've put a team in place, world-class management team in place, began to really expand the crop range, and we went from 0 sales to annualized 35 million in the second half of last year. So we're very excited. We're now shipping systems around the world, as far afield as Australia, and commissioning them and supporting our farmers.
Wow, that's an incredible lift off there. You must be really pleased. What's the big point of difference that IGS has over the other guys in this sector?
Well, first of all, our strategic position is to be a tech provider. You know, the old American analogy that the guys who provided the picks and shovels made more money from the gold rush than the miners did. Whether we'll make more money than our farmers is very unlikely, but we certainly aim to be the providers of those best tools. And so that's a deliberate position, unlike quite a lot of the well-known brands you will have seen who are trying to build their own farms and go around the world and grow stuff. Our belief is that, the Western world didn't even invent agriculture. It was invented between the Tigris and the Euphrates. So who are we to tell those people what to grow or how to grow it? And so our job is to simply empower and enable local farmers around the world who may have national or city or regional ambitions and provide them with those tools. What makes our system different is we've cracked the 3 really thorny problems. Number 1, how do you power hundreds of thousands of LED lights in a way that is, first of all, energy efficient, but secondly, gives you precision of control, which will enable you to create any spectrum. So in other words, to be able to mimic real light wherever the crop you're growing would naturally find its summer. And so therefore, you've got to be able to do things like pulsing, dimming, beam angle, spectrum, brightness, all of these things. And you have to be able to create, mimic a diurnal range, and you have to be able to mimic the growing season, because what the crop needs when you're germinating the seed is not the same thing that it needs when you're hardening off at the end. So that's the first one, the efficient and precise control and delivery of light. The second one is, as well as having hundreds of thousands of LEDs, you've also got at least tens of thousands of living, breathing plants. So you're putting these organisms in a metal box, and that's always going to be a clash. So ventilation is a huge challenge. The crops will take in carbon, they'll take in water, they'll take in nutrients, and what they will push out is hot, humid oxygen. You don't want any of those things. So managing the near field ventilation on the level of something like a growing tray is enormously important to deliver the right sort of wind, if you like, ventilation to the crop. But then secondly, you've got to get rid of that unwanted hot, humid oxygen afterwards, because that's just going to drown all the plants around the ones that are transpiring. So background ventilation and foreground ventilation, massive problem, which we've cracked and patented, like the controls on the lights. And then the third one is you've got to get the human beings out. So all these pictures that we see of people wearing white lab coats, a hairnet, a pair of goggles, and carrying a clipboard, that's a super piece of technology, the clipboard, poking at the crops and sticking their noses into them, breathing on them, bringing in pest and disease. No, wrong thing to do. So, artificial intelligence, if you tell it what the correct weather recipe is, it will deliver exactly that using this machine. What do you need human beings for? Nothing.
And as somebody that I've come from the sort of field scale strawberry industry, particularly polytunnels and tabletop, I'm really interested to hear that you've developed technologies there that I guess that we've been trying to deal with as an industry for decades. And because you're investing in solving problems that I guess weren't there in the first place until you started doing, what you just said, plants in a box, you've then created solutions for other crops. Now, before we dive into that, I just want to challenge you for a second. I understand it's close now to $2 billion has been invested in this industry of yours, the vertical farming industry, with some headline people from IKEA to Google to these celebrities to you name it. There's been a vast range of people that believe in this industry. And yet, I just got a quote from Dr. Paul Cuthier. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. He's a plant physiologist and a specialist in vertical farming. And his words are, you can't feed the planet with lettuce alone. And I just wonder with all this pursuit of essentially largely the cropping does tend to be a leafy lettuce that does tend to be high value, arguably some could say expensive. It might be okay in your pseudo kitchens and fancy restaurants, but does that feed the planet? So help explain to me and the normal human beings out there that hear about all this investment going to vertical farming on how we're going to feed the planet.
Yeah, and it's an absolutely appropriate question. The first thing I will say is that there is far too much hype, most of it actually BS and some of it just straight lies, talked by this industry. The industry is in grave danger of tripping itself up. I saw someone's video the other day claiming they had a 100% closed loop or recycled irrigation system. That is impossible because the crop is 95% water. So, what happens to the water that the crop takes up? Are they telling me they're extracting it back out and they're selling dried herbs or something? It's just nonsense. So the first thing to say is that if you take the crossroads between feed the world and climate change, which really are the two big things that I believe we can help contribute to, vertical farming will be part of the answer. A good example is the Singapore 30 by 30 food strategy. So they want to grow 30% of their crops in Singapore by 2030. They have described a diet which is 50% fruit and veg, 25% protein, 25% staples. So obviously we can grow the fruit and veg or some of it. And I reckon that, if you look at their belief is that they will be able to do 20% of fruit and veg and 10% of protein, and that will become their 30%. So I would say that vertical farming, once it matures, will probably be able to supply somewhere between 20 and 25% of the diet in terms of the number of varieties. It then becomes a question of how much of those varieties people consume in different parts of the world. We'll also be able to help with climate change, but we're not going to solve that on our own either. So let's get real about it. So that, I think it's very important to have that dose of realism. When you look at the economics, one of the big American systems, we saw some of their numbers recently, and they grow big warehouses mostly full of kale, and their prices are sort of $13 to $15 a pound to produce kale. I don't understand how you're ever going to make any money doing that. People do talk about leafy greens a lot. So let's just take one example. Basil is roughly 40% of world herb production because of the popularity of Italian cuisine. If I go to my local supermarket, I'll get a 30-gram little cellophane pack, and that would equate to about 30 to 35 pounds a kilo, depending on the season. The wholesale price in the Spitalfields market in London is 28 for organic, 20 for non-organic. Our farm gate cost of production is £2.70. So from an economic point of view, we can make our farmers extremely competitive. But the good news is we've gone way beyond those leafy greens. So we're doing things like starter plants for tomatoes and strawberries to go out into polytunnels. We've done brassicas such as broccoli. We've just harvested 6 varieties of seed potato, all absolutely perfect. And the great news is that instead of taking a growing season to go from a stem to a baby tuber the size of your pinky fingernail, and then cold storing it over the winter, and then planting it out to grow the seed potato in another season, so a total of 18 months, we got there without having to replant the thing in 75 days. So it's incredibly quick by comparison. And we've done carrot, we've done celery, we've done radish, we've done baby turnips, all sorts of things. So roots, fruits, and leafy greens.
That's a big difference. You gave some costs there for basil. I was looking at the numbers from other vertical farmers that they wouldn't be close to that, would they?
We haven't seen anything that's close to it because they're just, the yields are not great, they're not very efficient, and they haven't cracked those 3 big things: the labor, the energy, and the ventilation.
A lot of people are talking about it, but I haven't seen any evidence of it yet. But I'm sure there'll be some comments on this, so we'll see. So these other areas, I mean, I'm particularly interested as somebody that in strawberries, we had a massive problem with Phytophthora. I know you and I have had previous conversations about this, and I understand nematodes and potatoes, particularly the seed industry.
Yep.
And it seemed that to some extent, farmers are expected to actually accept a level of pathogens or basically unhelpful diseases. It's just part of the process of buying the plant produce.
Yeah.
And I guess what you're talking about there, reading between the lines, is a totally biosecure environment.
That's correct. I mean, the stats that I heard about the strawberry industry in the UK, the starter plants, I believe, mostly come from the continent or North Africa, and something like 35 to 40% of them are never planted because they're diseased or damaged or they've got bugs on them or whatever. And my understanding is that costs the industry about £12 million a year, just in that. And we've seen similar things. You mentioned nematodes with seed potato. Yeah, absolutely. But the guys we've worked with on the broccoli, they bring up 100 million starter plants from Lincolnshire and Lancashire every year. And the building of a vertical farm to grow their starters will justify itself just by reducing the transport cost alone. And so, the other great thing about it is it normally takes 6 weeks to get to about a 6-inch plant that you can put out. Ours takes about 11 days. So it's very, very quick.
And that's when you start to see the productivity gains that a plant breeders dream in the middle of the night previously.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the wider industry, because I understand you invented a new system to transport your electricity within your vertical farm system. And I know your vertical farm system is selling incredibly well around the world from what you said already. But then I understand you've got this system, which I think you call the grid, that has transformed how you can circulate power.
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit more about that and the other ways of potentially affecting what I understand now is called horizontal farming, which is, to me, is glass and poly. But why do you think that's an opportunity for that industry?
So going back to the start of my story, Sir Henry Aykroyd, our founder, was doing just that up in Aberdeenshire. And he was looking for something that would provide this supplementary lighting. So the obvious thing to do would be to create something you could suspend from the ceiling of a greenhouse, a glass house or a polytunnel. And so that's exactly what was created. Rather than using copper cabling and things like cable trays, which are obviously heavy and will drag and they're very expensive. We invented a system, or rather our founder, Dave Scott, co-founder, invented a system which uses the sort of transformer you'd use to power a sawmill. It doesn't have to be terribly big, but basically generates low voltage electricity. So low voltage AC, and it sends it through triple aluminium buzz bars. So basically aluminium tubes, very light, and can be put together with a patented connector. So we have a patent on doing this. We don't use single phase electricity like every other LED installation in the world. And if you know anything about your physics, you know it's a sine wave. It's basically going up and down. And when it's in the middle, not the top or the bottom, it's switched off. So basically, this electricity single phase is switching LEDs on and off 50 times a second. Well, our system overcomes that. We use the three phases to balance each other, and then we rectify it to DC, which gives it the perfect amount of power to drive LED lights. And that is why we're able to be energy efficient. That's why, and we use this as the distribution system, but also the system of control over the lights. And that's why we can make any spectrum, and we can basically mimic any climate that you like. And we use that in the horizontal sense in a polytunnel or a glass house. And then we use it in a vertical sense inside the vertical farm.
And I can only assume then that would also lend itself to other IoT devices that could be plugged into that where necessary.
For climate control, for monitoring, whether it's cameras or sensors or whatever, absolutely.
Came across, David, the other day, an Israeli business, and they've invented a sound wave that all insects below 3 millimeter explode when they when they hear the sound. I think they I don't know whether it's even, I wasn't even sure whether it's a spoof call. I'm supposed I'm going to get one on April the 1st one day, but you have to put one of these these speakers that send out that sound wave every 10 meters. So this could be another device to put on your grid.
We discovered a bug killer totally by accident. It was Armistice Day, I think it was 2018, and I asked the guys if they could grow red poppies for Remembrance Sunday. We didn't have enough time. We do grow flowers, but we didn't have enough time. So what they did was on Remembrance Sunday, they turned off everything apart from the red lights, and we put a webcam into the tower, and people really liked it. But when we came back in on Monday, the tiny little flies that we'd got off some batch of peat or whatever it was had all gone. It turns out that they can't see red light. And so the only light they could see was the UV light in the bug zapper at the back of the tower. So we actually had a massacre on Remembrance Sunday, but it was it was a massacre of flies. So
that's a great story. By the way, the point is that stuff is going to get invented as we get more elaborate, and the more data and the more knowledge we get. I can only assume that we're going to want more things to go on these devices.
Yeah, and there are lots of great manufacturers around the world, making the lights, making the sensors, making the cameras. And so our job is to provide basically an infrastructure that makes the most of all of these various inventions. And then you simply clip them onto the buzz bars, and away you go. Yes,
again, back to the vertical farm industry, how you've come up with innovations to solve problems that weren't there. And then from a classic sense, the fascinating transfer then of those innovations coming back through. So for instance, data, analyzing the data, starting to micro precision manage different A/B tests of different recipes, of different sequencing, of all kinds of different things that you can do. Starting to deploy that in a horizontal farm, in a glass house or a permanent poly environment, could have massive implications on the industry.
Yeah, I mean, we from a data point of view, we think about generating what we call growth recipes. So the growth recipe is, if you think about the weather, if you want to simplify it, the weather consists of the sun, the wind, and the rain. So you've got like a three-dimensional, almost like a hollow cube. Each one of those dimensions has 8 to 10 major factors. So we talked about some of them on the light earlier. If you think about the wind, you've got wind speed, you've got a volume of gas, you've got a mix of gases, you've got temperature, and so on and so on. And what you're really looking for with that is a very even flow of a large mass of air moving very slowly, so you don't ruffle the canopy of the crop. and you get very even growth, which is what a lot of off-takers are looking for. You then discover that each one of these factors has got an almost infinite number of possible values. Let me go back to light spectrum. Think about when you're going to repaint your bathroom, you go into a DIY shop and you stand there looking at the color swatches and you fall out with your partner after 5 minutes because there's too much choice. Well, that's what light is like. There is an infinite number of possible colors. And so therefore you've got to be able to make that. But the beauty of it is you can then experiment. So if you've got the ability to control the sun, the wind, and the rain in slightly different ways in different areas of either a polytunnel or trays in a vertical farm, you've got this massive workbench in effect. And you can discover what the optimal growth recipe is for each variety. And then once you've locked that in, the artificial intelligence will just continue to deliver it. And then we would use machine learning to watch what happens to the crop as we apply that growth recipe. And of course, you can vary substrate and the seed you buy and all that kind of thing, as well.
And you provide that data processing?
Yes.
Yeah,
it's all done in the cloud, and it's all done from the farmer's mobile phone. So you don't need an IT department to do this. Farmers don't want IT departments. They just want to get on with growing.
And the potential to start using the machine learning that could start to learn across all the different ways of doing this, that then you learn from each other almost.
Yeah.
To accelerate this and to be at the front of that would be pretty damn interesting. We've seen it in other sectors. Previously spoken to you about a German business that's reduced the plant selection by 80% just by better data science for plant breeding. And you think, well, then we start to apply that across the growing system or propagation to then growing systems. There's incredible efficiency gains here, cost savings, genuine cost savings. So when we talk about, back to the point, is if we can feed the planet because we're actually removing costs, not adding costs. I think the perception is the vertical farming industry is perceived as adding costs.
Yeah.
And what you're telling us here today is the opposite. And we're going to reduce costs across the entire industry of horticulture, not just vertical farming.
And with that experimentation we discussed a moment ago, it's not just about growing a wider and wider range of crops, but it's about growing them more efficiently, using less energy, and so on and so on. And in fact, we have now agreed a vertical farming tariff with one of the power companies, because the way our farm works, you can actually give control of it to the electricity supplier, and they can switch it on and off when it suits them. The crop doesn't mind when it gets its 18 hours of sunlight. It doesn't have to have it during particular hours, and it doesn't have to have it in a single block. It turns out that provided you allow the crop to rest for accumulated 6 hours in every 24, it seems to be fine. And so therefore, we can continue to innovate and change these things and make them more and more efficient.
The opportunity here as well is that it's not dependent on where it is. And this would apply to vertical or horizontal because of the level of...
Absolutely. We can stick this thing anywhere. I mean, it's one of the 5 or 6 major environmental improvements, as well as the economic, is the ability just to put this thing up wherever you like. So on a piece of unusable or unused brownfield land close to a point of consumption, you're going to massively reduce the food miles and the carbon debt.
So pulling this all together, the horizontal farming industry can now benefit from vertical farming. Vertical farming place because of its go anywhere thinking, but to actually take the hundreds of acres of vertical farming into the many hundreds of thousands of hectares of horizontal glass and permanent poly, that is an enormous market, exciting opportunity in our post-COVID world of needing to eat better, hopefully more affordably, and everything else. David, it's a really exciting time, and I think talk about a moment in history where we need this more than ever. And we look forward to finding out your next steps in the near future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rob. It's been a pleasure.
Wow, what an amazing call. All the flack that vertical farming has been had from the non-believers, if that isn't evidence of a potential transformational change that could be happening for the entire horticultural industry. And I guess the lesson here, the biggest lesson that I think I've learned today is thinking about this as an omni-channel. By that, I mean, it's not, should it be vertical farming, should it be horizontal? It's going to be all of it. And innovations that are happening in both are going to work together with both. So now we're talking about vertical farming technologies being applied across hundreds of thousands of hectares of poly and glass. That is going to change how we buy food and how we eat food in the fresh produce sector. Now, if that isn't the most important thing we can do right now in this crazy planet we live in, because we can't live off lettuce alone, but we can live off a whole range of fresh produce that these systems can grow. So super exciting times. Thank you for listening today. I hope you found that interesting. I certainly did. We're always looking for speakers and topics to talk about at the Forward Food Tech podcast. If you feel want to get involved, then give me a shout. Contact details will be in the notes. Other than that, have a great day. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. For more information and takeaways from this episode, please visit forwardfoodtech. See you next time.